want to welcome everyone to our September 30th Pride Gathering meeting, and we've invited R.J. McKay to talk about legal protections. Now, legal protections are a very important thing, especially to Lexisnexis, when you consider the rule of law. Now, what is the rule of law? We take this for granted, but basically it comes down to four main points. We have equity under the law. The law applies the same way to all people. Regardless of who you are, the law will be applied the same way, equally to everyone. You must have transparency in the law. Laws aren't very useful if no one knows what they are. They should be clear, precise, affordable, and accessible, providing basic human right protections. You must have an independent judiciary that can interpret and rule in the law in a fair and unbiased way. And lastly, people need access to legal remedies in a timely manner or courts of law. And it's no surprise that countries that don't enforce the rule of law tend to have lower economic development, less wealth in their nations, higher mortality with birth rates, all kinds of interesting things. So a country that has good rule of law, there's a correlation between the wealth of that nation and the rule of law. Plus, for LexisNexis, it makes a very good business for us to promote the world of law around the world. So today, R.J. McKay, who was born and raised in Dayton, he moved to Michigan for a while. He lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He went to Alter High School. He went to Indiana Wesleyan University, and he got a degree with an emphasis in journalism and business. And today, he's going to be speaking to us about LGBT protections, and he's been involved with the LGBT community. He's an activist in the area, and I want you to warmly welcome RJ as he takes the stage to speak with us.
Thank you, Julie Sue.
Yep.
Yeah, just to let you know a little bit about myself, my partner and I have been together for almost 18 years. We do have a wedding that is in the planning stages. Actually, after work today, I get to go meet with the florist, and later this week, I get to go meet with the caterer, and we get to do all of the fun things, finally, that other couples have been able to do for years and years. I am currently the treasurer of the Greater Dayton LGBT Center, and been with them for about a year and a half on a volunteer basis. In the past, I've also worked with PFLAG of Dayton. PFLAG Greater Dayton has a youth group, and I was an advisor to their youth group. I started and co-formed and ran an organization called Diversity Dayton, and that was pretty much from 2004 to about 2008. And we had a lot of fun with doing some advocacy in a pro-LGBT way. We actually sponsored about 5 billboards that went up in all parts of Dayton, and just tried to overall promote a good, positive message for the LGBT community. So I have moved around a bit. I've lived in northern Michigan. I've lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which, yes, the South is kind of a different world from what we're used to here in Ohio. But I met, actually, that was with a fraternity job, and I met a wonderful person down there who I'm still friends with. They ended up moving up here to Ohio. But it was one of those where, oh, wait a minute, you're gay and I'm gay? Well, hey, you know what? We're both fraternity presidents, and, we both lead a lot of people. And, he has since moved out of Louisiana, I think for personal reasons. But anyways, yeah, so I've kind of been around for at least a decade in the advisory and the advocacy role for LGBT, for the LGBT movement. And what I want to do today is kind of talk to you about the law of non-discrimination and protection, mainly in the workplace. A lot of times housing gets lumped into the same thing. You'll hear housing and employment non-discrimination. So a lot of times those get bumped into it. And I might refer to terms, it's pretty much all the same thing. Non-discrimination, anti-discrimination, equal opportunity, that's all to me kind of the same realm of policies, especially when it comes to HR and employment law. So I might phrase it differently, but it all pretty much means the same thing. Before I really get going, one thing I really want to do is kind of break down a really not too in-depth, but a good history of the general LGBT movement. Because a lot of people think that, especially in the past 5 to 10 years, is when the movement's really started. That's when it's gotten the most traction, and that's when the most things, I believe, have changed. But really, the movement goes way beyond that. Most LGBT people and our allies know about the Stonewall Riots. Well, those were in 1969. And those actually were later in the LGBT movement than most people realize. Everybody thinks that was kind of the start, because that's where Pride celebrations started from. And that's where a lot of our organizations have their names from. But really, in 1924, Henry Gerber formed a group in Chicago, and they were called the Society for Human Rights. And they are credited as being the very first gay rights organization in the United States, and they're actually documented as such because they had to incorporate with the state of Illinois. So they actually formed paperwork. They didn't last a whole long time, but there's actually documented paperwork with the state of Illinois proving that an organization was started back in 1924. And we jump ahead a bunch of years. Everybody knows, or most people have heard of Alfred Kinsey. You know, his research when he published Sexuality in the Human Male in 1948, that really brought forth a lot of LGBT, I mean, granted it was specifically gay male, but that brought forward a lot of LGBT ideas that people really hadn't thought about before. You know, that showed that about 37% of men surveyed at that time had some sort of same-sex experience. You know, that was a lot more than most people ever thought in that time, and I think it's, you know, more than people think even in today's time. In 1950, the first national gay rights organization was founded in Los Angeles. That was, if I'm butchering the pronunciation, I apologize, but I believe it was the Medellin Society. And they really, even in 1950, they wanted to unify the community. And when I say the community, I mean specifically more the LGBT community. But they also wanted to attempt to show to the greater general public community that we're here and we're really no different than anybody else. Jumping to San Francisco in 1955 was the first lesbian organization that was specific to lesbian rights. A year later was kind of a big one. That's when Evelyn Hooker published her work on the differences between heterosexual and homosexual men. She was a psychologist, and she studied and interviewed both straight and gay men, and then did a big published survey, or study, I should say, and her work proved that there was really no psychological difference on a clinical perspective between straight or gay men, which that in turn ended up kind of being that first little nugget of information that people took, that when the American Psychiatric Society or Association finally ended up to say that, hey, you know what, being LGBT is not a clinically diagnosed disorder, you know, that was the first little study that kind of launched that whole idea that there's really, it's not a disorder, it's not a mental condition, it's more of just a fact of life. It's I'm left-handed, it's I have blonde hair, it's, you know, more along those lines. And also in the 50s, you know, everybody right now, you know, thank goodness, you know, the Supreme Court just ruled on marriage equality on June 26th of this year. Not many people know that the Supreme Court's very first LGBT case was ruled on in January of 1958. There was a magazine that, it was called the Homosexual Magazine, and people could subscribe to this. And of course it was wrapped in plain paper and it was mailed to your house, and nobody knew, you know, the postman didn't know, the neighbors didn't know. His, you know, just like the times in the 50s and 60s, and even today, you know, some magazines are still wrapped in plastic when they arrive at your house. But this magazine was started and became so popular, it was being mailed out. Well, the Postal Service and the FBI got together and they said, this is obscene material. We will not mail this out. You cannot publish this. This is wrong. It's you know, not going to happen. So the founders of this magazine sued basically the FBI and the Postal Service and ended up winning, taking it all the way to the Supreme Court and winning based on First Amendment rights. That, this magazine had, cannot be closed down and has to be distributed by the Postal Service, and just like any other magazine out there. So the first Supreme Court case, it ruled in favor of the LGBT community. It was actually way back in 1958. Then the states started decriminalizing homosexuality and sodomy starting in 1962. In 1966, the National Transsexual Council Unit was formed. That was the very first peer-run support and advocacy group specifically for transgendered people in the entire world. And it was founded in San Francisco after the police cracked down on some groups and meetings, and there was some riots. So after a bunch of transgender riots in San Francisco, this group was formed in 1966. Speaking of riots, that brings us to 1969, the famous Stonewall Riots. The Stonewall was a bar in New York, still is a bar in New York, and it was getting raided all the time by police. The police were, I guess, bored on a Saturday night and went out and said, hey, let's go raid these bars because what some of those people are doing is illegal. So the Stonewall Riots happened, and that was kind of the launching point. That's the reference point that everybody uses for LGBT movement today. Actually, the movie, I believe it was released last Friday, Stonewall. Go see the movie. It's all about the riots in 1969. The historical, just like any movie, the historical facts on that are not 100% accurate. It was actually a group of drag queens that first refused to be arrested by the police that started the riots. I think in the movie it's just your run-of-the-mill gay white male. But yeah, I would go see that movie. Moving through the 70s, we had a lot of change with the American Psychiatric Association saying that, homosexuality is not a mental illness. Harvey Milk, who some of you may or may not be familiar with, he was a politician in San Francisco who got elected and then the following year was shot simply because he was gay. There's also a movie about that. Then we get into the 80s, and Wisconsin, actually, out of all the states in the country, Wisconsin was the first state to ever outlaw discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So this starts to kind of get us into today's discussion on, state laws and policies for non-discrimination. Over the course of the years, more states adopted laws to prevent or discourage discrimination based on sexual orientation. But again, where we stand today, that I'll get into later, we're a little over halfway there. There's still a lot of states, including Ohio, that don't have any laws to protect the general LGBT community. And then, you get through the 2000s. Massachusetts becomes the first state for marriage equality in 2004, ramping all the way up. I'll kind of skip the 2000s because that's what we all remember. So anyways, my point of that little exercise was just to show you or let you know that, yes, in fact, the gay rights movement or the LGBT movement in America has actually been going on for 95 years, if not longer. But we can document it as far as 95 years back. And as we know, especially in the human resources world and the policy world and the law world, of course, documentation is what it's all about. So, like I had mentioned, some states have non-discrimination laws for the LGBT community on the books, some don't. Right now, there is no current national law protecting LGBT citizens in employment and in housing. So that is a big, huge concern, since employment and housing is a majority of somebody's life. If you think about it, if you're not at work and you're not at home, where are you? How many hours of the day do you spend at either work or home? And currently, under national law, there's millions of people that could either be fired from their job or kicked out of their home based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. one interesting thing was I actually worked in staffing. About 6 years ago, I spent a couple years working at a staffing agency here in town, and it was a lot of fun, and it, it was of course a challenge, but it was a lot of fun. When I was talking to them about pride events I was going to, or things that I was doing, or talks that I might be giving at a lunch and learn, we got talking about non-discrimination policies, and my manager, who had been in HR for years, said, well, you're protected under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? No. A lot of people think we are, but we're not. And it was just kind of interesting, because then I went around and I kind of did a poll in the office, and I said, okay, we're all theoretically HR professionals. Do you think protection is written in the law or not? And a surprising majority of my coworkers thought protection was already there. That's kind of a double-edged sword, because the good thing is, well, if people think it's already there, then they know better than to discriminate. I mean, one, it's wrong on a moral basis, but two, if you think it's the law, you're going to follow it. But then again, once I educated them that in fact you could be fired for being gay, lesbian, or expressing a different gender identity than what you're born with, that of course by educating people, sometimes you run the risk of, oh really, I can do that? Luckily that didn't happen. But things are starting to change on a national level. In 2012, the EEOC said that they would go ahead and accept gender discrimination claims. Now that's a little bit different than your basic run-of-the-mill LGBT discrimination claim. If I say that I was fired because I was gay, or I didn't get a promotion or a job because of my sexual orientation and things that I do at home that are not any part of the workplace, that, according to the EEOC, may not be enough to get through. But if I say that based on the fact that the Title VII enumerates sex, if I am not acting like my sex should act, or if I identify with a sex that I am not biologically a member of, then those are a little bit easier to get through. And the EEOC did say that, especially for transgendered individuals, those cases are more clear-cut. So starting in 2012, they said, yes, we will accept any discrimination case for transgendered individuals. Or at least they'll investigate it, not that they would totally take it up. But again, depending on the creativity of the lawyer you hire, if you are discriminated against in a job, people have been able to say, well, a normal man would go home to his wife and they would, do family activities all weekend, and I went out and I hung out in the gay bar all weekend, and I was discriminated against because on Monday people were saying, what were you doing? I said, oh, I went out and partied all weekend and met a bunch of friends and, was having a gay old time, and, instead of saying, oh, I went home and took care of my kids and my wife. It's stretching it, but we know in today's world, if you hire a really good lawyer or a creative lawyer, they can try to get almost anything into the courts. So the other topic, especially recently, is marriage equality. The one thing that I always like to impress, just on a little side note, is it's really, as we went around, and even I had to evolve on this, it's not same sex or same gender marriage, it's marriage. When I get married in April, yes, it's a same gender ceremony, or there's two gentlemen up there, but it is still a marriage. So one of the things we've tried to do is drop the reference to gender or the reference to sex off of it, because at the end of the day, it really is just marriage. And with the recent marriage equality ruling, a lot of people are like, hey, great, it's done. No, it's not done. It actually was putting the cart before the horse. A lot of people in our community really wanted to get the non-discrimination laws passed first and then get marriage passed second. Although marriage is the bigger and the better, depending on who you ask. The one thing the marriage equality ruling has created is now a case where, yes, we can get married, we can have this special event in our life, but it also opens us up to more discrimination and a higher possibility of people at work finding out, it was easier to hide in the closet before, but now we're so excited because we want to share the fact that we're getting married that we put in an announcement in the paper, or we'll bring wedding photos to work and put one on our desk. Well, unfortunately, the way, especially in the state of Ohio right now, the way all the laws are is I can get married and I can have that legal marriage wedding certificate or the marriage license, but if I put a picture of my spouse and I on my desk at work, I could be fired. Because if the boss doesn't like the fact that I'm gay and two men have a wedding photo, there's nothing I can do. So, so really, that's why I said I kind of put the cart before the horse, because it does have the potential to create situations. And we have seen a few. Granted, it's usually, I think the two examples aren't necessarily what I call mainstream corporate America. It's been teachers at religious schools that are getting fired for not following the religious doctrine. So that one can be ruled either way in the courts, and I think it's still kind of making its way through the courts as far as was it a legal firing or was it an illegal firing. And that's what we're going to see more. Just on a side note, is what's eventually the idea of religious freedom is going to go to the Supreme Court. Which right trumps the other. And so we'll just have to see how that goes. But again, on a state level for workplace and housing non-discrimination laws, 21 states in the country do have laws on the books protecting the LGBT community from being fired at work. And usually, like I said before, they lump those together. So that's also, you cannot be denied an apartment. You cannot be kicked out of a rental property. Accommodations have to be made if they're going to rent to the general public. So 21 states do have protection. 19 of those 21 also include gender identity. And that's a big thing within the community is gender identity. The T on the end of LGBT is sometimes forgotten. And I can see why in the past it was, because even as a gay man, I will admit that years ago I didn't understand the T in the LGBT community. And just like with anything else, if you educate yourself about it and you get to meet people, it becomes clear, you understand it. And there was actually big flack in Ohio about 5 or 6 years ago when a protection law was being talked about, and it actually passed it passed the House of Representatives, but to get it to pass, they dropped the T off of the LGBT. So it was approved by the House of Representatives in the state of Ohio, but it was only good if you were gay, lesbian, or bisexual. If you were transgender, the law would not apply to you. As fate would have it, the Senate killed that, so we were back to square one anyways. But that did create a huge rift, and a lot of people actually came out and said, it's either all or nothing. If you don't include the T on the end of LGBT, and actually it's LGBTQA now, but if you don't include it, we don't want any part of it. So, again, Ohio does not have a law for either. Equality Ohio, which I've been a member of for, pretty much since their founding in 2004, they have been trying for at least a decade to get the state of Ohio legislator to pass a law to protect the LGBT community. And again, it did pass the House of Representatives, and it was a bipartisan bill. It was great. The only problem was it left off the T, and the president of the Senate at the time, he decided that he really didn't want that bill to go anywhere, so he killed it. It actually sat on his desk until the session expired, and once the session expired, the bill was dead. So they've reintroduced it, and it's still grinding its way through the legal process up in Columbus, but to right now we have nothing. As far as, okay, so we have no national law, and in the state of Ohio we have no state law. So that actually takes it down the next level, which in and of itself does create some issues. On the next level, you have municipalities. So either cities or counties or villages can say, hey, you know what? Within our borders, we're going to have equal opportunity and non-discrimination. The city of Dayton in 2007 passed an ordinance that included and enumerates sexual orientation and gender identity in their human rights ordinance. So again, for housing and employment discrimination, that is illegal within the city limits of Dayton. Yellow Springs has a similar one. I believe Toledo has one. Cleveland is a recent, or a suburb of Cleveland has one. There's about 15, of course Columbus has one. There's about 15 municipalities within Ohio right now that have these protections. Excuse me, I'm sorry, wrong number. 29 municipalities. 15 was the 2007 number. But yeah, 29 municipalities, and of those include counties and cities. Of those, 11 cities are fully inclusive, which means it's both gender identity and sexual orientation. Now, the problem this brings up is, again, kind of with that educational piece of, telling everybody we can be fired because we're gay. A lot of people don't think that happens. When you start having municipalities do a patchwork of protections across the state, you get people that end up changing legal statuses twice a day at a minimum. For an example, when I lived in Columbus, and I lived down kind of in the southeast side of Columbus, outside the city limits. Well, in my apartment, I was not protected because I was outside the city limits. So if my landlord found out that my partner and I were living there and he didn't like that, they could have kicked us out at any time just for that reason. But when I drove into the city of Columbus for my job, all of a sudden I became protected. I could not get fired from my job. And so that's why I say the status changes, and that's something that I bring up to legislators all the time. I say, this patchwork, although it's small steps to get to where we want to go, why should I have to suffer, and why should I have to think about, okay, where am I right now? Like right now, city of Miamisburg, I'm not protected. If I drive into the city of Dayton, I'm protected. So that kind of creates a whole legal thing. And again, for some people that might assume that, the city of Dayton's got this great protection. Yeah, well, that it does not extend past the city limits. So every time you drive into the city of Dayton and you see that little welcome to Dayton sign, sigh of relief. Every time I leave Dayton, luckily my experience in the greater Dayton area has not been bad at all. So I haven't needed any of that. But again, Dayton is a progressive city. They like to be inclusive. And so for the past, 7 years, almost 8 years, they've had this law. They also went, a couple years back, the city of Dayton did a domestic partner registry. So, and that they actually expanded to the entire greater Dayton area. So even though I live out in Beaver Creek, my partner and I did sign up, and I do have a card still in my wallet until I get married, that says that, my partner Todd and I are registered on the domestic partner registry for the city of Dayton. One of the nice things Nan Whaley did as mayor was they sent out a special letter to anybody on the registry, and they said, if you're on the registry and you want to get married within the first 60 days after the ruling, Nan Whaley will do it for free. So that was a nice benefit. We decided, well, we'll go ahead and plan our own thing and do it that way. So that's where the national and the state and the local laws are, which brings us more into so you've got some protections, but not all protections. But what about companies? What about like here at Lexisnexis? Well, obviously, as I hope most employees have read the handbook, you know that you are protected because Lexisnexis does have a non-discrimination policy and an anti-harassment policy that does enumerate for gender identity and sexual orientation. The good thing is that, like LexisNexis, 89% of Fortune 500 companies have sexual orientation protections kind of voluntarily put in their handbook. So that's a large number of businesses, and that's a large number of people that are covered, at least in the workplace, by their companies. But there is a big difference. only 66% of the Fortune 500 companies include gender identity. So there is that big 23% swing of, yeah, I'm protected, but a transgender person may not be protected, even though we work at the same company in the same building doing the same work. So one thing that I did many years ago when I was talking to legislators in the state of Ohio that kind of has to do with business was I compared the 50 states, put them in order of their per capita income. And Ohio ranked, I want to say somewhere about 26, 27. The average for the country was 20. So I can't remember the exact state, but the state that was at number 20, maybe it was Pennsylvania, they had the exact average of per capita income for the United States. For the states that were above average, 16 out of 20 states had state laws protecting for housing and non-discrimination for the LGBT community. So 85%. And what I wanted I just found that out and I was like, let's do a comparison. When I did that, that's what I took it to Columbus and I said, hey, Mr. Republican Senator, let me show you some money. Because I can't say whether they were higher on the per capita before they had those laws enacted, or if the laws had anything to do with drawing business there, and thus it produced more money for the state. But again, it was interesting that 85% of the above average states had these protections, and when you looked at the below average states, very few had them. So there was definitely a correlation there. Other measurements are the Human Rights Campaign, the HRC. For people that may not be aware, if you see little equal signs, blue backgrounds with yellow equal signs, that's the HRC logo. I've got one on my car, so if I pass you or you see me on the highway or something, that's what that equal sign is for. It just says I support the Human Rights Campaign and equality in general. But the HRC does an annual corporate equality index, and they've done that for, I believe, the past 13 years. Yeah, past 13 years. And when they first did it, 13 businesses got a 100% rating as being perfect LGBT-friendly organizations, which means they had non-discrimination policies, they promoted at the same rate and hired at the same rate. They didn't look at sexual orientation or anything like that when they came into job decision making. Over the course of the next few years, even 3 years ago, only 189 companies that did the survey got 100%. So in 10 years, they jumped from 13 to 189. So that's a great, great step forward. The 2015 index had 366 companies that scored 100%, which means, the 100% obviously is a perfect score. That means that you have the policies in place. That means that you have organizations like Pride that promote LGBT issues within the company. That means that you provide transgender inclusive health insurance. There's about 6 categories or 6 things that they look at. It's very quick surveys. Do you have this? Yes. Do you have this? Yes. Do you have this? No. Okay, you scored 90% or you scored 50%. It is great to announce, or I'm proud to say that standing here, Lexisnexis earned a 90% in the 2015 survey. So Lexisnexis is way up there, earning an A, way above average. The only thing that Lexisnexis could do to improve the rating would be to have the transgender inclusive health insurance. I looked into it. That was the only thing that knocked the 100 down to a 90. Other than that, just looking at the company policies and the company culture and the Pride organization, Lexisnexis is an A-plus company to work for, in my opinion. And I really like when I got to see the very first paragraph of the non-discrimination policy here, that not only it just said, yeah, you know what, we're into non-discrimination and it's okay because we kind of have to because we're a big company and people expect us to, and no. The policy is actually that the company is proud to have a professional and congenial workplace. That they respect courtesy or they expect courtesy, respect, and professionalism. And as such, discrimination based on a whole laundry list of criteria is not going to be tolerated. And, you know, when I read that, I was like, wow, that's a really cool statement, and it just goes to show how progressive the company really is. Excuse me. You know, the policy here obviously is written like most policies, where it says, you know, hey, if you need to make a claim, here's how to, you know, get an investigation, here's who to notify, and it shows what steps will be done and what will be, or, you know, that the investigation, then there's possible action, and then there's education. So, you know, it was really neat to see that Lexisnexis does, like most professional companies, have that fully inclusive and step-by-step policy that's easy for the employees to understand. You know, and that kind of goes into my personal thing. Whenever I've started in companies, that is kind of a thing I look for. You know, is sexual orientation in their non-discrimination policies? How far do they go with that? Is there a pride organization at the company, or is there not? I've worked for companies that both do have and don't have protections. I've actually been discriminated against at a company that had protections, but you know, that was a decade ago, and I wasn't so out and confident, and I didn't have rainbow stickers and whatnot on my car, so I kind of quietly left. And that's one thing that the business community, I think they understand now, or the majority of the business community understands, is that your talent pool. Yeah, you might not think you have gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgendered employees working for you, but there's a good possibility that you do. And just like any other customer, they may not bring up a point when they are discriminated against or when they don't feel welcome. They may just quietly leave. You know, I'm sure every company has plenty of customers that call up and complain. And you have just as many, if not more, that just quietly go to your competitor because, you know, I don't even want to mess with having to do an investigation and all that. I'm just going to go find another job. So, and that happened to me. You know, it wasn't a major discrimination, but the VP of the company and a regional manager who was above me made comments that weren't the end of the world, but they made comments that really, I was like, I don't need to be working here. And so that company lost what in my mind, a biased opinion, what in my mind was a great manager. So they had a pretty big hole to fill, although it was filled and life went on. You know, in my, you know, talking with people and just everyday interactions, I always try to throw in a bit of the LGBT community. I try to throw in the fact that, you know, my partner and I were in Seattle last weekend, or that this happened or that happened, or, you know, that, hey, we're planning a wedding. And to share that with people is a lot of fun. And to share some of the fun things that have happened with when I call up a vendor and they ask for the bride's name and I say Todd. Because that's what they're not expecting that. Even now, they're still, one of the vendors did say, oh, I'm having to get used to that, but no worries, we got it. So, but similar to that, you know, there's one story that I'll end with that I really like to talk about. At the job I'm at now, my partner and I got engaged years ago, and we wear our engagement rings, and they will become our wedding rings. But, you know, to anybody that sees it, I would naturally assume, okay, what's your wife's name? And that's a question I was asked. And I answered Todd right off the bat. Without missing a beat, we're walking down the hallway. Oh, what's your wife's name? Small talk, chit-chat. And I say, Todd. And she, oh, okay, cool. Kept on going. And that's what businesses should strive for, that type of you know, culture and that type of workforce that everybody's cool with and respects the different diversity from everybody else, so you don't have any run-ins and you don't need to have investigations and you don't need to have action taken, you know, whether it's the law or not. So, so that's about all I've got for today. Does anybody have any questions or need clarification on anything? Or no? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. And I think Julie's going to come back up.
Thank you, RJ.
Thank you.
Before you walk off stage, I wanted to show you a little appreciation for coming to speak with us. And point I want to make from your presentation is I had mentioned that when you enforce the rule of law, there's all kinds of interesting correlations with economic development and personal wealth. And the fact that you had pointed out that the wealthiest states within our union, 85% of them have protections for LGBT people on their books, and the bottom half have hardly nothing. And it's just another example that when nations and states enforce the rule of law, as we talked about earlier, that it leads to prosperity. But I wanted to give you a $50 Visa gift card to show
Thank you.
you the company's appreciation for you coming.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and it was fun to be here.
Let's give a round of applause for RJ.